The story begins with a young, well-dressed man asking his girlfriend to break up. The wind is blowing around and leaves are flying past these two who are already standing at a distance. The young girl, immediately not believing what she hears, begins to question him with the hope that it is a joke. It was precisely this look of hope. Louise Thérèse de Blois refused to believe what was happening now. It happened on Friday evening, a long party for the return of the second son of Count Clermont. But for Elle de Blois, it was a lucky evening. François said he no longer wanted to be her judge. This is the biggest nonsense in her life. This was incomprehensible to her, because Elle de Blois and François were already engaged. And so suddenly he decided to throw away so many years of their joint life in the trash. But it was clear from the expression on François' face that his intentions were serious. He coldly replied to the girl that he simply didn't love her anymore, and this broke the young beauty's heart even more. The knock of someone's heels was heard from the side, and Adelaide de Gran entered the room confidently, but calmly. She glanced at François and said with a smile that perhaps it was time to tell everything. The girls looked at each other. It was clear that they knew each other. Elle was shocked by François' chosen one. Adelaide apologized for what happened. She approached François, firmly took his hand, and affirmatively explained that they had loved each other for a long time. Adelaide did not hide her joy at finally telling her rival. Elle's face was wrinkled, and a quiet tear rolled down her cheek. The flowers that were woven into her hair seemed to fade in an instant, and she looked as if she was somewhere out of place. Elle asked again if it was all true. For some reason, Adelaide didn't even think that this news could somehow alarm Elle, so she asked if she was happy for her and François, although in her heart she was already celebrating her victory. After this strange question, Elle's look changed, but through strength she said that of course she was glad. However, the fist tightly clenched from below spoke of something completely different. In one moment, a seemingly fragile fist just flew into François' stomach. After all, what were they hoping for? She has never heard such nonsense, and Elle has not yet lost her mind to be happy for them. And now François is standing curled up on his knees in pain, and Adelaide is fussing around him, asking if he is all right. Then the young girl realized that she had done the right thing. Embracing her lover, Adelaide abruptly turned to Elle with an angry expression on her face, and shouted that she was doing such a thing at all, and how could she do such a thing? But after looking at her opponent, she was not jokingly scared. In front of them stood a completely different Elle, cold and confident. Now that she knows about their love affair, she herself is ready to break off their engagement. She briefly said that they were breaking up. And one more thing, François himself had to deliver this news to the Marquis, and most importantly, not to forget to indicate the reason for the break-off of the engagement. That's what a young girl who recently lost her lover said. With these words, Louise turned around and quietly left the house. There were threats in her back that it wouldn't just stay like that. She was asked to stop, but Elle steadfastly went. Adelaide hugged François tightly, shouted something to Louise, tried to even order her. But what did it matter when the young girl had already made a firm decision to break off this relationship? Meanwhile, the party continued. The stars rose in the sky and the palace was lit up with lights from all the halls. The party was in full swing and the invited guests did not miss the opportunity to have a good time. Louise entered the bright, spacious hall, walking along the central carpet and looking around at the dancing couples. Her look was confused and she didn't know what to do next. The friends, happily waiting for Elle from François, were surprised that she returned alone, because they went to the garden together, and she came back alone. So they asked Louise what happened. Louise smiled and replied that she and François had broken off their engagement. The reaction did not take long, because the friends were simply shocked by what they heard, and were sure that they would soon be walking at the wedding. Their eyes were filled with curiosity and a bit of fear, as they felt that she must be completely broken right now, so they uncertainly asked if Louise was okay after such a breakup. Having recovered a little from the news, her friends gave Louise a glass of champagne and happily congratulated her on her freedom. After all, according to their experience, in such moments of life, alcohol is sometimes the best remedy. So the girls raised their glasses and decided to fill that void in Louise's heart. Glasses met for a toast to Elle's release from unnecessary shackles, and everyone drank to the bottom. The ball continued. Theodore appeared in the central hall, actually the main culprit of the ball. Immediately, whispers began from all corners, and the guests surrounded the respectable, handsome man from all sides. It was not so easy to go to Mr. Theodore. Louise's friends also paid attention to this. They secretly tried to follow all his movements, because for a long time he remained an enviable groom. For quite a long time, the second son of Count Clermont did not appear here at all. Everyone was interested in one thing. What was the reason for his sudden appearance? Louise and the girls stood apart and discussed Theodore. The friends were interested in what he was like before because Theodore and Ella studied together at the military academy. And also, judging by the gossip, he used to look like a wild dog. Terravini was interrupted by the appearance of Francois and Adelaide in the hall, but also hand in hand and together. Louise was outraged by their appearance in this form in public. Everyone around was talking. Did the gossip that spread so quickly around the palace come true? And if so, are they not ashamed? Everyone who is not lazy discussed such shocking news. Everyone was talking, but Louise looked down in silence. She couldn't believe that the person she got engaged to would turn out to be such a scumbag. But in fact, deep down, she had suspected it before. It changed when Adelaide appeared. Francois just couldn't take his eyes off her when she was around, even if he was with Louise. It was hard not to notice. She was extremely beautiful, often seen in a lavender silk dress with bright bows and ruffles. Therefore, it is not surprising that Francois could not resist such a beauty. Perhaps due to the fact that Louise considered Francois her soulmate and best friend, she simply desperately closed her eyes to everything that was really happening. She didn't want to believe it. And like a fool, she continued to cling to him, to cling to his presence, not even considering the possibility of letting him go. Louise believed that everything would pass and they would be happy together. On the day of their meeting, Louise was returning home on her white horse, tired from the road, when suddenly a fair-haired young man approached her, who immediately attracted the girl's attention. His name was Francois Nobar. Molodic bowed politely and congratulated the girl on her return. Even then, Louise realized that their meeting was not accidental and that they were destined for each other. He offered her his hand, but Louise admitted that her hands were covered in dust from the road, which did not stop him at all. On the contrary, he gave her a bright smile and said that it was a great honor to meet him. Returning in her mind from the past, Louise saw a glass of champagne in front of her, the couple who had entered, and just stood up without saying anything. She went out into the street away from the palace. Oh, if she had only known that everything could end like this, she would not have agreed to marry Francois for anything, even if she had known that his heart could change. She couldn't believe that he could do this to her. But if only she could turn back time, she would definitely have lived these years in a completely different way. But she could not do that. She had before her eyes his image on the day they met. His hand was her salvation. How she wished she could go back to the day she fell in love with his words and that smile. If this happens again, she will never... Stumbling, she fell to her knees and realized the simple truth that she would not fall in love with him again for anything in the world. The leg hurt more and more, and there were more and more tears. It hurt so much, both inside and out. She prayed that the Lord would hear and show mercy and bring her back that first day. She said, if the Lord has even a little pity for her, then let him do it. Lying in her dress on the grass from exhaustion, she asked the Lord again and again to bring her back. Bring her back again. Louise felt like she was on the gallows, all in chains, mutilated. Something terrible was staring at her. It was so terrible that her blood froze in her vessels and the ability to move somewhere disappeared. Francois's voice from the darkness said with a terrible coldness that all this was because Louise would be executed. And the fact that her lover spoke such terrible words made the girl even more afraid. She couldn't believe there was a reason she could be executed. After all, what could she do wrong? Is this a dream? She wouldn't want to die like that. A bright, spacious bedroom. Louise is spinning on the bed. It was a terrible dream. The voice in the room tried to calm her down, but moving away from what she saw turned out to be much more difficult than she imagined. The girl clearly does not understand through the dream what is happening, where she is. But in any case, it was a dream, and this dream is over. But she was glad of this more than anything in the world. The voice in the room was male, and now he asked if Louise had a bad dream. He assured that now everything is fine because he is nearby. But who is the same person who spoke to her was a mystery. Louise knew that voice, it seemed. She had already heard him somewhere. How familiar he was. She opened her eyes. There was a handsome man with dark hair and sharp features in front of her. In front of her was such a spacious but strange room for Louise. Questions hung in the air. Why is she here and why is she with him? Too many questions demanded at least one answer. She got up and gradually began to regain consciousness. But the answers did not appear. Mr. Theodore looked at her self-confidently, but somehow meekly. I wonder if he knew her story. Mr. Theodore, with his shirt unbuttoned, tried to say a nice greeting. But how Louise ended up in the same room with this wild dog Theodore, the confused girl could not figure out. Theodore tried to say hello again, using the prefix ma'am. The question of why she was here came to Louise's mind again. She understood that yesterday she had broken off her engagement with François and had gotten very drunk. Auguste Theodore Jean de Clermont is the second son of the famous knight Count Clermont and the younger sister of the Emperor Claire, Countess Amelia. Theodore and Louise studied together at the military academy and, moreover, he was the initiator of the ball at which she broke off her engagement to her lover François, whom she planned to marry in a month. Yes, at that ball she was completely broken and depressed. Her life turned into a horror for her in an instant, and now only memories remind her of her past life. In any case, she woke up dressed, the clothes left on her after a night she doesn't remember. So that brought a little relief to the situation, and the young lady calmed down a bit. Louise was recovering from sleep, and it was time for the main question: what actually happened during the night? Theodore threw an excited look at her, as if he was playing with her, and asked if she really did not remember. Louisa answered that she did not remember anything. Theodore told, sitting next to her, that he had brought her into the room after he had found her drunk and unconscious in the garden. It turns out that he saved her. Louise mentally remembered what she could remember about last night, how much she and her friends had drunk, and imagined how Theodore was carrying her drunk from the garden in his arms. She hoped no one saw it. She also remembered that out of all those present, only Mr. Theodore tried to somehow help her in that situation, for which she was very grateful to him. Louisa and Theodore had actually spent a lot of time together at the military academy, but they had never been close to each other in all that time and had only brief conversations about training. It was this guy who just lost his temper once during a knighthood ceremony. This is him, the boy whom everyone knows as the Wild Dog. But the question is, what is the reason that he saved Louise? Theodore saw that Louise was thinking about something and tried to find out. And she still did not understand why this wild dog suddenly began to address her as a lady. This made her feel a bit scared, and she clutched at the blanket. Was there really something between them? She is dressed, and therefore, most likely, there was nothing. She really hoped for it. Because if it is not so, then it will be a shame for her. Louise decided that she had to be more careful with her own movements and words, until she finally figured out what had happened last night. Louise turned to Theodore, but instantly he was at a minimal distance, explaining that even though there was nothing between them, how long had he held back? And one night definitely won't change that. Theodore looked at Louise with a seductive look and continued to say in a low voice that she must feel something that did not happen last night, because it is simply impossible to forget such a thing. Louise understood that indeed he had saved her, but why he suddenly began to behave like this remained a mystery to her, and she did not want the answer to her to be the one that Theodore alluded to. However, Theodore came closer and closer to the confused girl, and in a moment his voice sounded right next to her ear. He whispered softly in her ear that he wanted to do this to her. Hearing this, Louisa pushed the boy away from her, sharply calling him crazy. The young girl refused to believe what was happening between them now. Freeing herself from his embrace, she immediately ran to the exit, barefoot and without looking back. She came across a sufficient number of jerks in her life, and her fate threw up more and more such meetings. Theodore glanced at her and then added that he was sure that they would meet again very soon. The young man was 100% sure of this. Louise ran nowhere but home. When she ran to the estate, it was already daylight, and all the staff of the house were busy with their own affairs. Louise flew into the living room, where only the nanny was. Seeing that Louise was breathing heavily, the nanny asked if everything was okay. That young girl did not have time to catch her breath yet, so she remained silent. She then went on to ask where Louise had been last night and why there was such a strong smell of alcohol in the room. The young girl was ashamed to confess, so she remained stubbornly silent. Not receiving an immediate answer, the questions continued. The nanny saw that Louisa's face was dirty, so she was very worried and prayed to God that all her worst guesses would not come true. With her face impoverished, Louise mentally acknowledged that she had to hide the fact that she had spent the night in the same room as Theodore, especially after what had happened after the engagement had been broken off. But, pulling herself together, Louisa replied with a smile that nothing had happened, and she had to get to work. Of course, this cost the girl a lot of effort, but she had to do it. The nanny braided her hair in a ponytail, prepared her clothes, and then just stood and admired Louisa's work image. The nanny did not hold back and expressed a sincere compliment on how majestic Louise looks today. Louise stood in a clean uniform and looked at herself in the mirror. Nanny continued to praise her that there was no better knight in the entire Ron Empire than Louise. But she didn't feel like that after yesterday's events. All she felt was fatigue and depression from what had happened. She wanted to fall through the ground, remembering yesterday's evening and night. Eloisa Teresa Le Blois. She was the heiress of the respectable Blois family, which always protected the royal family. She was a knight of the Brown Empire and patroness of the Knights of November. Something about her changed the moment she put on the uniform. She sharply told the nanny that she could not live in grief forever, and thought that she needs a little more time to realize what happened this morning. Yes, her engagement was broken. It cannot be undone. All this was in a state of deep shock. The young girl decided to forget about everything as soon as possible and completely immerse herself in training. All day, Louise practiced like the last time, swinging the blade in all directions and practicing all the blows and techniques she knew. The blade was as sharp as before. In the midst of training, a green-eyed boy approached her and brought her a towel. It was Maurice de Rieux, the son of her mother's closest assistant. They grew up together and were like brother and sister. She hid the blade, while Maurice claimed that Louise looked exactly like the Countess in her prime. This embarrassed the girl a little because comparing her with her mother is already too much. Lady Laverne appeared on the horizon, also dressed in a uniform. She greeted everyone and noted that Elle and Maurice had gotten together unexpectedly early. Walking closer, Laverne was struck that Elle looked a lot better than Laverne thought, because she heard how Louise got drunk at the party yesterday and how she was ready to blow things up there. Laverne saw that she had slightly embarrassed Louise with these words, but she managed to get out of the situation by declaring that the Knights of November were better at drinking than anyone else. Such was she, Laverne de Lucy, from ordinary circles, but among the knights she was widely known for her unsurpassed ability to gather the necessary information. But because of her recklessness, she has not been able to get a promotion for several years. It is easy to imagine that this news had already reached Lady Laverne, and she was not even at that party. But Elle's thoughts were disturbed by Laverne's phrase, between the lines, that in any case, difficult times await Elle. And no matter how much the commander appreciates Lady Elle, it will not save her. Suddenly, Maurice stepped on Laverne's leg to interrupt her speech. After all, she has already said so much. Laren immediately took the hint and immediately closed her mouth. Elle noticed this and immediately glared hostilely at Maurice, asking what had just happened. Maurice pretended that it was an accident and that he knew nothing about it. Elle didn't believe him because the point was that he knew something about what Laverne said, so why not tell him the whole story? Louise was known for her persistence, so Maurice didn't stand a chance. Maurice understood that he needed to tell, slapped himself for what Laverne's long tongue had led him to, and replied that Elle should visit his office first. He went on to say that even though a knight's main job is to protect and carry out tasks on the battlefield, it is still impossible to constantly avoid the paperwork that has to happen. While Elle pondered what was said, Maurice and Laverne kicked their heels with a self-challenge to get back to work. Ella understood that something unclean was happening in the office. As she walked through the castle, she had a strange premonition of what might be waiting for her in the office. Yes, she didn't like office work, but it was a different feeling, closer to anxiety. Entering the office, she did not notice any chaos or uninvited guests. However, the feeling of anxiety did not leave Elle for a minute, and she continued to expect the worst. Her office must have been piled high with paperwork and piles of documents. But the office was perfectly clean. Something was wrong there, but what exactly the young girl had no idea. Footsteps were heard behind her, and in a moment the silhouette of another person was already standing behind her. Elle was addressed from behind with the prefix Mrs. She has already heard it somewhere. Elle was frightened, turning back because where did Theodore come from? To which he said that he had promised that they would meet again, and not a few hours had passed when his prediction came true. He knelt down and kissed her hand, introducing himself as the new assistant to the deputy commander of the November Knights. He was appointed last Friday. He gave his full name, Auguste Theodore Jean de Clermont, looked lovingly into her eyes, and added that now it would be an honor for him to work next to her every day. Elle threw himself into heat and cold at the same time from what he heard. In response to what she heard, she was only able to banally ask whether she had not heard what Theodore had recently told her. Elle flew into the commander's office furious, slamming the door behind her, although it didn't look like her. Until today, she was known as a balanced girl who knew how to control herself well. Immediately, in a fierce tone, she asked what nonsense was going on with her new assistant. The commander was not surprised by Elle's visit. He was just waiting for her. Laverne was also with the commander. The commander calmly informed Elle, wiping the bottle of aged wine, that she was now the second in command of the November Knights. After all, you can't leave the assistant position vacant for so long. Elle was in shock because no one consulted her about whether she needed an assistant and who, in fact, it would be. She noted that if she had the right to choose, she would not have chosen a wild dog as her assistant. The commander did not stop rubbing the bottle to a shine, at the same time stating that he understood her reaction, but noted that this appointment only confirmed that they all believed in Lady Elle. Elle did not believe what she heard, but the commander added that, despite Mr. Theodore's past, he is still a part of the imperial family, and to refuse such an ideal candidate would be simply stupid. Smiling, the commander joked that maybe it wouldn't be so bad if such a person went to her as aides. But neither Louise nor her current assistant has the right to make a mistake. Elle could not believe what she heard, she asked, and begged the commander to change his decision, but to no avail. The commander said at the end that nothing can be changed, since the process has already started. He placed the battered bottle in a drawer, and Ellen noticed that he was holding one of the finest wines in the Rhône Empire, Château La Durbelière, known for its exclusive rarity. The commander began to pack up, putting on his coat, and asked Laverne to remind him what was next on his agenda. He patted Elle on the shoulder, tried to encourage him that he should continue to work fruitfully. However, all this time, Elle had a question on her mind. Why the commander, who always drank cheap alcohol, had a whole collection of such rare wine? A possible answer was found. The Bellier region, where this wine comes from, belongs to the territory of the Count of Clermont. It turned out that they also knew about the commander's propensity for alcohol. The commander left the office. Laverne tried to follow him, but Elle stopped her with a question, because it turns out that Laverne knew all this. She denied everything without exception. Elle clung to Laverne's uniform because she knew everything, and they say she even knows what color underwear Her Highness the Empress is wearing today. Laverne continued to object. Maybe Laverne knew what color the underwear was, if it was Morris's underwear. There was a rustle of paper from the door. It was Morris who entered the room at that moment and dropped the papers from his hands. Laverne understood the gravity of the situation and began to explain in a sweat that this was not what Morris might have thought, that all this is a misunderstanding. But suddenly Ella stopped her and quietly turned to Morris. Elle signaled that Morris would also get kicked now, so she asked him if he still knew about her assistant. Behind Ella's back, Laverne tried to show that she didn't have to tell her anything. Morris began to explain that the previous evening they had received an official communication regarding an urgent matter. They could have postponed this letter for later, as the workday was already ending, but the letter had something that could not be ignored: the imperial seal. Elle's surprise knew no bounds. After all, since when has the imperial family interfered in knightly affairs? She is sure that it was done on purpose, and at the exact moment when she was at the party. If anyone could have open access to Elle's schedule and help Theodore for her own pleasure and curiosity, it could only be her. Elle decided to visit Her Highness. Her Highness was informed that the knight Eloisa Teresa Le Blois requested an audience with her. They were already waiting for her. Elle was allowed to enter the princess's room. She knelt down and greeted the princess, saying her name. The princess immediately asked with a smile, "Did Elle like her gift?" Elle found out that this gift was the handiwork of the princess. As the future empress already at such a young age, she had extensive knowledge in matters of diplomacy, military affairs, and politics. That's how she was, the daughter of the Ron Empire and the royal lady Maria Josephine Claire, better known as Princess Pippin. She was incredibly pleased with her own gift. Elle pretended not to understand exactly what was meant by a gift. The princess clarified that the gift was her cousin, the same mad nephew of His Majesty the Emperor. Somehow mockingly, the princess once again asked if Elle did not like her gift, because she did not hear the joy in her voice. Of course, Her Highness expected a different reaction from Louise. It turns out that the appointment of the wild dog as Elle's assistant was a gift from the princess on the occasion of the breakup of Elle and Francois's engagement, as if she had expected it to happen. The princess went on to say that at this rate, Lady Elle should soon be making headlines in the Empire's "Evil divorcee destroys the union of the century." It turns out that the rumors spread even before the end of the party. The princess then began to imagine possible headlines, which made Ella very angry, and she was not going to continue listening to such mockery. In a frenzy, she declared that all this sounded simply ridiculous and from what the princess took such nonsense. Then Louise still had hope that perhaps the publicity of their engagement was not so quick. The princess knew the details, so she immediately said that the divorcee was a lady from the Grand family. She added that she would never have thought of her like that, but it was obvious that she had done a terrible thing. So now that Elle's engagement broke off in this way, tongue twisters have a new reason for gossip. At that time, Ella bowed her head and thought about Adelaide and how they got along. The princess ordered Elle to raise her head and listen to what she had to say. She does not like it when the honor of her knight can be dishonored by such nonsense. Therefore, she simply could not stand aside. This incident made the princess very angry, because she could not imagine how that girl tried to dishonor the honor and dignity of the knight of Princess Louise. Elle's expression changed, and the princess added that that was why she had given Theodore to her as a present. But what relation Theodore has to her broken engagement also remained a mystery. The princess said that Ella did not understand anything about these matters, but she explained that one scandal can always be covered by another. Then she asked what Ella thought about it. Elle only asked again without answering, so the princess continued to explain that if the wild dog Claremont was under her complete control, then everyone would forget about her broken engagement? After all, due to the fact that Theodore made a fuss and ran away on the day of the inauguration, it is scary to realize that he was so simply left with the right to inherit. According to her aunt, when he returned, she would do everything possible to make him stay here as long as possible. But Elle was still concerned about all this. She was confused by other things related to Theodore. The princess kept explaining that no matter how much she thought about it, the most faithful person she had was Lady Elle. Her aunt very strongly persuaded her to do so, and the good heart of the princess agreed. Besides, my aunt said that if it was Lady Elle, she would agree to anything. Of course, from the outside, the imperial family seems perfect, but they need someone to handle such situations. Both Ellie and the princess need something grand to overshadow the resulting scandal. Thus, it turns out that their interests completely coincide, and they can serve each other well. Elle thought that, indeed, it would not be easy to overshadow that scandal, but at least she would remain alive. So she raised her head to the princess and declared that she could not agree to it if it was Theodore. Hearing this, the princess began to beg with a look that Elle would reconsider her decision and take her time with the answer. Elle tried not to look her in the eyes at that moment and repeated that she still couldn't. Undoubtedly, the princess was upset, because everything turned out to be not quite simple, and she thought that everything had already been decided. Besides, it was just a brilliant plan that should have satisfied all parties. The princess changed her tone to a decisive one, saying that in this case it would be best to do the following. And I wanted to offer to leave everything as it was until this morning. But in one moment, the princess found herself next to Elle and with a pleading look asked how she felt about a 10% increase in wages. Her Highness knew the weaknesses of her knights. Elle could not refuse this offer and regretted it very much, because there really was no choice. All because of the damn family debt, and Louise was the only one who could pull them out of the debt pit. Going to the office, Elle thought about what had happened. Everything has already happened, it's a fact, so you have to take advantage of it. Entering the office, Elle informed Mr. Theodore about some rules. She told him that since he was her assistant in the future, if he did not follow her orders, he would be punished more severely than the other knights. Theodore kindly replied that he understood this and smiled sweetly at Lady Elle, which caused an ambiguous reaction from Elle, because during his studies at the academy, Theodore created a sharper and unpleasant impression. Elle looked around the clean and tidy office where everything was in its place and shone as if she had entered it for the first time. It turns out that everything is not so bad in this appointment of an assistant. Elle still felt that the spirit of the wild dog did not leave the room of the office, and despite the order, she felt his presence in every corner of the office. The silence was interrupted by the sudden movement of Theodore, who quickly approached Elle. He whispered softly why Ella was so wary, moving his hand past her neck. She immediately let him know to take his hands off her. Theodore reminded Elle to remember that he was her dog now, so if she wanted to push him away, it would only irritate him more, so she should think things through first. She told him to shut up and reminded him that she was the one who stopped him when he lost his temper at the ceremony. Inauguration. So even though it happened at the request of the princess, it doesn't mean anything. Theodore reacted to what he heard by asking, "Is she also afraid of the wild dog Claremont?" But it was a shock for Elle, she was not afraid of him. So she declared to his eyes that she was not at all afraid of Theodore. A knight knows no fear but the fear of her master. Therefore, she has no one to fear, except for Princess Pippin's own master. So Louise once again reminded Theodore not to expect anything. After listening to everything that Elle said, Theodore replied that in that case she would have to tighten his leash, because next to such a beauty he could not vouch for his actions. Theo at any time, because that would be the reason for the wild dog. The crowd frantically chanted for the witch to be executed. They call her a traitor and aggressively call for her to be killed immediately so that no one will think of repeating her actions. Elle stands chained in front of the guillotine. It is announced to her that she will be executed for mass murder and treason, and this sentence will make the young girl bleed. It was a dream again. Elle woke up in horror from what she felt in the dream, and from the fact that the terrible dream is repeated not for the first time, but thanks to God she manages to wake up in time. She got up and looked at the clock. It was 5 a.m. Ella realized that she would not be able to sleep anymore, so the young girl decided to take a walk around the estate to relax a little. Walking into the living room, she met the nanny already going about her morning routine, but she saw that her Lady Elle was already awake. Ella explained that all this was due to the nightmares that tormented her. The nanny understood what was the matter, because the young girl had already shared her night terrors with the maid more than once, so she immediately offered breakfast, speeding up her walk. In the morning paper, Ella saw the headline, "Wild Dog Claremont becomes assistant to Elle de Blois." As her grace said, no one mentioned Elle's broken engagement. This fact lifted her spirits a little. For a moment, Elle imagined how Theodore would tell her every day that he was looking forward to joint tasks with the prefix ma'am. And after that, the desire to go to work disappeared. Meanwhile, the nanny had already prepared breakfast and they talked. Ella asked the nanny if she had ever dreamed of her own execution, but she doesn't particularly remember her dreams, so no. But somewhere the nanny heard that if you dream of death, it is a sign of good luck, and in general, a dream is just a dream. So she urged Ella not to pay attention to it. So the maid tried to calm the worried Louisa. While eating breakfast, Ella came to the conclusion that the reason she had been having nightmares lately was the extreme fatigue that had fallen on her from the stress. She sped up so much that she surprised the nanny, and when she asked if Elle was really so hungry, she smiled and explained that her favorite maid's dish was extremely tasty. Morris was already at work, leisurely reading a book, and noticing Elle's arrival, noted that she was already 26 minutes late. Elle knew this well, so the extra reminder only made her angrier. 2 days have passed since Theodore was appointed as her assistant. Because of this, she just went crazy every time, as she remembered. Louisa didn't want to go into her own office anymore. Morris commented that apparently Elle might be afraid of something, but he wasn't hoping for his own assistant. Elle admitted that she was really afraid of Mr. Theodore and offered to exchange assistance with Morris. But he didn't want that, so he jokingly showed that it was time for him to get down to business. Morris gave Elle a book he was reading. She did not understand why he was giving it to her, so she twisted Morris's strange gift in her hands in confusion and did not know what to do with it. Morris waved to her as he left and added that, who knows, maybe one day she will be useful to her. Recently, the young girl did not like these riddles anymore, and she looked at the book once more. On the way out of the hall, he turned to Elle and reminded her not to forget that there was a special event planned for the Knights today, which Louise, of course, had already forgotten to think about. Elle felt that something was going to happen today and came to the conclusion that she would definitely lose her mind soon, if not for one reason, then for another. They parted ways with Morris and Elle went to the office. Getting ready, Ella grabbed the door handle of the office and suddenly the door opened from the other side. It was Theodore. He scared Ella very much with that action, but he asked why she didn't come in. She entered and Theodore greeted Lady Elle again, wishing her good morning. But how much she wished that he would still be kind, which has happened very rarely lately. She asked a direct question that she had wanted to ask Theodore for a long time, namely why she was his mistress. Until recently, no one had called her that, and she liked it and it annoyed her at the same time. He didn't answer her question, but reminded her to call him Theo, because that was what he had told her to call him before. Elle complied with his request and once again addressed him with this question, but already calling him Theo. The girl knew his stubborn character and risked being left without an answer. He briefly slipped out, saying that it was because the lady was his lady, and continued to look at her with interest, what other questions she might ask. Elle continued to think out loud that let them go to the academy together, but then what was the reason that he suddenly started calling her his mistress? But the answer was repeated, because the lady is his lady. Elle, this answer did not satisfy her. In an instructive tone, she tried to ask why, being an aristocrat of the highest rank, he became an assistant to the deputy commander. But now Elle's patience snapped. She urged him to stop it, snapping that she didn't care what he thought of her, so she ordered him to call her Lady Elle from now on. In response, Theodore simply turned his back on her and refused to obey her order, which both angered and confused her. Ella was ready to lose her roof. Trying to soften the situation, he added that in any case, from today he will work hard for her, so she cannot worry that everything will be at the highest level. He approached Elle and admitted that he was so confused that he could not sleep all night. But he came, as usual, so close that Elle had to ask him not to come so close. He disobeyed again and continued to shorten the distance. Elle knew he was dangerous, so she intuitively took him by the coat and in one professional move placed him face down on the table. He tried to get back at her, asking if she was trying to tame him, but Ella replied that he himself understands everything, so she is not going to repeat her request twice. An angry Elle said that she had heard that he was not interested in things that did not entertain him. Is she so interesting to him that he personally asked to become her assistant? For some reason, Theodore was as relaxed as possible at that moment. Looking at the expression on his face, Ella concluded that this jerk was actually enjoying Elle's actions. She released her grip and Theodore got up, but Louise's cloak was lying on the floor. Theodore reached for him, but Elle twisted him again with a quick movement and pinned him to the floor. At that moment, Laverne entered the office with the news that she was on her way to the main office. None of those present expected that someone would witness their personal confrontations. Seeing what was going on, Laverne awkwardly asked if she was being a distraction, only to be met with an angry look from Elle. Elle said sarcastically that everything was fine and Lady Laverne was just in time. Theodore bent down again to pick up the cloak, quietly complaining why she was struggling with it, because he just wanted to take the cloak from the lady. The man tried to do everything as calmly as possible. He calmly raised the cloak, and Ella was embarrassed, because she did not even think that his intentions were different. Although somewhere in the depths of her soul, she had doubts about his intentions. Recovering, Ella turned to Laverne as she said she was on her way to the main office. She asked Theodore to go with Lady Laverne and look at the specified documents. Indeed, this is a great opportunity for Theodore to learn more about the work of the senior mates from Lady Laverne. And it's also a great reason for Louise to get rid of the annoying Theodore. Theodore kindly replied that he would do it if his lady ordered him. Laverne thought it looked really cute, but Elle clearly didn't like it and decided to keep quiet this time. She gave Theodore a serious look and ordered him to do it again, but as his mistress. Then she continued that, if this is possible, then he should quickly learn everything possible. Theodore meekly agreed and replied that he understood everything she said, and then he got to work. Finally, Louise breathed a sigh of relief and smiled in satisfaction. Theodore and Laverne walked across the square to the main office in complete silence. Theodore noticed Laverne's furtive eyes on him, as if she wanted to ask something but did not dare. So he was the first to ask Laverne what made her so interested. She noted Theodore's charm and remarked that if he smiled the way he smiled at Lady Elle, she was sure he would win quite a few girls. To which Theodore replied that he thought Laverne was more interested in Mr. Morris. Laverne was embarrassed for a moment because she didn't know how he knew about Morris. She assumed he was a mind reader. Departing from his charm of Theodore, Laverne still wondered why he called Lady Elle his mistress. But it was difficult for him to explain it. Perhaps there are several reasons for this. Then he stopped, turned to Laverne, smiled softly, and noted that for him his lady could only be Elle de Blois. Laverne smiled back at him and said that everything is the same with her, and only Morris is the master for her. It turns out that they are in the same boat and each of them already has their favorites. They had almost reached the main office. It was a 7-story building, majestic and heavy, surrounded by a garden. Most of the important decisions were made here. Before entering the office, Laverne turned to Theodore once more and warned him that from now on he had to be alert, because the senior colleagues were very particular. Meanwhile, Elle was sitting at the table in the study, leafing through the book that Morris had given her. She had a strange name. There are no bad dogs. Elle thought she must have lost her mind at these hints. In the book, she opened a chapter about the importance of walking dogs, because they adore them. It was stated there that a walk helps to relieve stress, to find a common language with other dogs. This is a natural need for both mental and physical health. Ella seriously considered walking the dog, but she felt very tired after a sleepless night. Louise thought that her assistant and Laverne would need quite a long time to negotiate with the aristocrats, and she would have the opportunity to sleep and recover her strength. Before Ella had time to close her eyes, the door to her office suddenly opened, and Theodore from Laverne entered. The girl cheerfully reported that the aristocrats surprisingly quickly agreed to everything. Laverne said that thanks to Theodore's skill, they did everything in the best way. Ella looked at the young people in surprise, praised them, and asked what exactly the talk was about. Laverne explained that as soon as they approached the chamber of aristocrats, they all froze in fear from Theodore's single look, so they were able to solve all cases as quickly as possible. When Laverne told all the details of their meeting, she quickly ran out of the office to brag to Morrison how they had managed to cope with a difficult task phenomenally today. Louise looked with interest at Theodore and wondered to herself how he managed to handle the capricious aristocrats so virtuosically in a couple of hours, although it had taken weeks before. Then the young girl thought that it was possible from her assistant, and it would be of some use, at least to take as an example her office, which looked perfectly clean and was not filled with a pile of clutter. The young girl looked at Theodore and looked for some new pluses in his appointment, and at this moment, to Louise's great surprise, they had already accumulated quite a lot. And then Ella noticed that Theodore took his eyes off the paper documents, and for a moment their eyes met. The girl was very scared that he noticed how she was watching him. The young man also began to look into Louise's eyes with interest, and she already regretted that she looked at her assistant like that, who now did not take his eyes off her. Then Louise noticed that there were still scratches on his neck, reminiscent of the recent events of their acquaintance. And most of all, Elle wondered why he was staring at her like that. The girl tore her gaze away and took a glass of water to quench her thirst, but all her thoughts were about Theodore, and she couldn't even take a couple of sips due to excitement. The young girl immediately licked the drops of water that fell past her mouth, and then caught herself thinking that Theodore continued to observe all her actions. His look was simply unbearable, and Louisa, abruptly putting the documents on the table, said that it was enough work for today, and they would continue their work tomorrow morning. Theodore was surprised and asked the girl why they had to stop everything, because he had not yet studied the theft case that was assigned to him. Louise explained that they had to go on a street patrol. An hour later, Louise and Theodore were walking side by side through the streets of their city. Theodora tried to remember all the names of the streets and their location in order to better navigate the area. When the young couple stopped at the intersection of two streets, Theodore began to clarify whether this path actually went to Hosier Street. And Louise noted his phenomenal memory for such trifles. This area was under the supervision of the Knights of November, and the vast majority of rich people lived here. The streets were calm, and there was no need to lose vigilance, because crimes also took place here. Louise told her assistant that from now on he would be out patrolling the street more often, and he quickly asked if she would patrol with him. Unsuspecting, Louise replied that the patrols were in pairs, so they would be walking together. Theodore took the opportunity and came closer to Elle, asking if he would be with her. Louise felt a bit uncomfortable when he came so close, so she quickly replied that she did and moved away from Theodore. He smiled with satisfaction, and it was hard not to notice. Elle then concluded that his mood had greatly improved as soon as he learned about the walks and remembered an article from a book about improving the physical and mental health of dogs. Suddenly, the young girl stopped and with a watchful eye turned her attention to the dark entrance, in which it seemed to her that someone was. She shouted loudly, asking what was happening there. But there was only silence in response. Then Louise decided to personally check that gateway and was already going to rush there to see what was happening there. Louisa did not have time to run to the entrance when a cute cat came out to meet the young girl, who looked at this animal with surprise. Louise put her weapon back in disappointment and said in a voice that she didn't expect to see a cat here. And Theodore said that the cat is quite cute and gentle. The cat did not pay attention to the young couple, who kept their eyes on her, sat down in the middle of the street, and began to carefully lick herself. Louise smiled and invited Theodore to go on. When the young people moved away from the entrance, a man in a dark corner grinned with satisfaction and ordered his partner to sit as quietly as possible. And when Louise and Theodore walked further through the streets of the city, she could not get out of her head the thought that she seemed to be losing her grip because she was surprised that she had made such a mistake at the entrance. Theodore decided to support his superior and said that the patrol was going quite well because the surrounding areas are known for their quiet streets. Louise replied that she of course agreed with Theodore's opinion, and recently they had an experienced thief who does not give rest to the local residents or the knights. Elle said that this thief skillfully takes everything from the houses of aristocrats, but despite all attempts to catch him, no one managed to catch him. And he has a nickname, Marshmallow. The thief received such a nickname in honor of the god of the west winds, Zephyr, due to the fact that he ran away from the scene of the crime so quickly, as if the west wind and his tracks were never followed. Theodore offered to walk a little more around the outskirts of the city, and Louise replied that for today their patrol had come to an end and they should return home. Louise's assistant was very upset because he did not want to part with his boss, but she said that their working day was over, so it was time to part. Theodore looked at Louise with sad eyes and said that he wanted to take another walk. At that moment, Louise caught herself thinking that he looked like a dog begging for a walk. The young girl said that they have already gone around this area twice, so his task before the next patrol will be to remember in detail the location of all the surrounding houses. And while they were sweetly talking about the future plans of their patrol, a man wrapped in a black cloak suddenly ran up to the young girl from behind and pushed Louise in the back. The man immediately disappeared from the scene of the adventure, taking Louise's bag with him. Theodore immediately rushed to help the young girl up and asked how she was feeling. The boy tried to examine her leg, and Louise quickly explained that she had sprained her left foot at the last party, so she could not pursue the criminal now. In the meantime, the thief was getting farther and farther away from the young people, and Theodore tried to convince Louise that she needed to be given medical help and taken to a doctor as soon as possible. Louise saw that Theodore hesitated and told him not to worry about her and quickly catch up with the thief, because it could be the famous Marshmallow. But Theodore insisted on helping Louise. Then the young girl could not stand it and shouted to her subordinate that he had to catch up with the criminal at the same moment and that this was the order of his superior. It was obvious that the man did not like the prospect of leaving Louise alone with an injured leg, and he had no other choice, so he shouted that he obeyed and rushed after her. The first minutes of the chase, Theodore did not even see the thief, because he had already managed to move far enough away while he was trying to explain to Louisa in order to take her to the doctor. But quite quickly, the boy managed to find his way around the area, and he saw a man in a black raincoat running down the street, holding a bag with Louisa's important documents in his hands. Theodore decided to chase the criminal down a parallel street, because during the patrol, he was already able to remember the location of the area and was sure that this way he would quickly catch up with the thief. Theodore's plan turned out to be quite successful, so after a few minutes, he was a step away from the attacker and, shouting at him to stop, took out his sword and prepared to attack. The attacker also did not care and felt mortal danger, but thanks to his good physical training, he was able to successfully dodge Theodore's blow and bounce back from the sword. For Theodore, this was an unpleasant surprise, because few of his opponents could boast that they managed to evade the skilled blow of Theodore's knight. This angered the young man even more, and he began to pursue the criminal with greater zeal. In a few movements, Theodore was already hitting him with his right leg. The man in the black cloak fell to the ground and began to cover himself with his hands to at least somehow protect himself from the maddened Theodore, who did not think of stopping to attack the intruder. Theodore approached the criminal in the shelter and loudly asked him how he dared to touch his lady, and said that he would soon regret this act of his. Theodore took out his sword and swung, shouting for the man in the black cloak to say goodbye to his life, because only with blood can he wash away his dirty deed. A second before striking, Theodore heard a familiar female voice tell him to stop. When he turned, he saw Louise, who expressed her admiration for his wonderful work. Confused, Theodore looked at his boss's leg, and she continued to say that she did not think that he would be able to find his way around the area so quickly and catch up with the thief in a flash. Next to Louisa was Morrison, who explained that the initiation party for the novice is a special event that should not be missed by the entire cast of November Nights, and that is why they have gathered here. Theodore turned to the intruder, whom he had recently been chasing, and saw the man undressing. And when the black cloak was falling down, the boy was wearing the clothes of a Knight of November. Then Theodore realized that the injured leg and this thief had been specially arranged to lure him to the bar where the novice was being initiated into the Knights of November. Louise said she was sorry they had to trick Theodore, but it was a tradition of knighthood that each of them had gone through before, and Theodore was no exception. The young girl held out her hand to Theodore and said that he had successfully passed the test, and now she could not ignore him because he had become one of them, for which she congratulated him sincerely. Elle said that she welcomes Mr. Theodore, or rather Mr. TEO, to the ranks of the November Knights now officially. She expressed hope for their successful cooperation in the future. Theodore held out his hand to Louise and smiled sweetly. He thanked them for having intervened in time in their fight with the intruders and stopped him. Out of the corner of his eye, the young man once again looked at the knight, who was trying to get away from the fight with Theodore, and added that Louise managed to avert something irreparable. Louise smiled and invited everyone to go inside the bar, because the knights have already gathered and are waiting for the party to start, so they cannot disappoint them and delay the start of the drinking. Louise also turned to Jerome, who was today in the role of a thief, and thanked him for his good work. The young girl noted that his game was very realistic, and she herself believed him. Shocked, Jerome looked at Theodore, with whom he had just engaged in a duel, and said in his voice that their fight was not a game at all, and Theodore really wanted to kill him. Laverne was inside the bar helping the girls get ready for the party. She skillfully placed the dishes on the tables, and when the culprits of the holiday came in, she was happy that everything would finally start soon. The girls said aloud that she thought they would have to die before they could wait for them at the celebration, and added that they were glad to see Mrs. L., Theodore, and Morrison here at last. Laverne asked how everything went, and Morrisno concluded that Theodore passed today's exam with flying colors and expressed his sympathy that the girl had to miss everything. Then Louise asked Laverne where the commander had gone, because she had already scanned everyone present with her watchful eyes and noticed that he was not among them. The girl explained that the commander had gone to help with matters related to Zephyr, so he would be delayed a bit, and he allowed the celebration to begin without him. Laverne explained that the jeweler had made Her Highness the Princess's pendant broken and asked the commander for help, thinking that Zephyr would try to steal the expensive piece of jewelry. One of the knights said that this thief gives the stolen things to poor children. But still, this does not make his crimes legal, and a thief remains a thief despite these noble deeds. Morrison intervened in the conversation about the famous thief, who made a remark to everyone that they all gathered here not to discuss the intruders because they have a better reason. Louise said that they should all take their seats at the table to start the party, which she advised them to do. Therefore, the boys began to look carefully at where they should sit. Theodore immediately approached the young girl and asked if she was free. She answered yes, and he asked permission to sit next to Louise and smiled sweetly at the surprised girl. After looking at the dishes on the table, everyone drooled because they had not remembered such a grand celebration for a long time. There was so much food on the festive table that even gourmets could envy them. When everyone settled in their cities and took their filled glasses in their hands, the knights instinctively began to look for the commander, who was usually the first to make a toast. Since he was not at the celebration today, Morrison offered Louise, as the deputy commander, to take on such a responsible mission and say the first toast at the knights' dedication party. Louise was embarrassed and there was nothing to do, so she took the glass in her hands and got up from the table. She congratulated everyone on the fact that today they gathered on the occasion of the entry of a new knight into their squad. Louise also expressed her hope that after today's ceremony they will all be able to get to know Mr. Theodore better and accept him into the ranks of the Knights of November, with which she sincerely congratulates him. The young girl said her toast so veiled that everyone realized that their new knight belonged to the royal family, so they should all be nice souls to him. Lady Elle enjoyed great influence among her knights, so everyone took her words quite seriously and raised their glasses, welcoming Theodore into the ranks of the Knights of November. Raised glasses were immediately emptied and placed on the table. All the knights began to taste the food and refill their glasses. But the conversations at the table somehow didn't stick together, and this was noticed by Louise, who was present at almost all the knights' dedication parties, and this one, compared to them, turned out to be the quietest and most boring. The atmosphere at the table was quite tense, so the knights just poured and drank their glasses in silence, snacking on hearty food. Louise looked at Theodore, who was the Earl's son, and by coincidence the protagonist of all the unpleasant gossip of their town, so she remarked to herself that the atmosphere was not strange. The knights were joined by Laverne, who asked why everyone was so quiet and if she could sit next to Morrison. Louise thought that finally this talkative girl would save the dead party. Laverne then turned to Theodore and thanked him for saving her today. The other knights asked what exactly he had done that Laverne was grateful to him for. And Laverne began to tell interestingly about today, when Mrs. L instructed her to go to the main office and gave her assistants Mr. Theodore. Everyone was eagerly waiting for the continuation of the story. The girl was so interestingly telling all the details of today's meeting with boring aristocrats that Louise decided that if she left the party right now, no one would notice. Therefore, the deputy commander quietly got up and headed for the exit. But Theodore immediately noticed how his boss wanted to use this opportunity to escape from the party. And when there were a few steps left before the exit, the young girl heard someone behind her asking where Mrs. L was going to go on such a responsible holiday. All the knights paid attention to these loud words and turned their heads, seeing the back of Louise, who was trying to disappear unnoticed from the party. At that time, Louise cursed Theodore in her mind and stopped. Theodore, of course, noticed how his boss was confused and caught off guard, so he smiled sweetly, repeating his question. When all the knights heard that Theodore called Louise mistress, they began to whisper about it. Louise blushed to the roots of her hair because everyone heard him call her. Louisa already regretted that she had decided to sneak out of the party unnoticed and stood as if dug in, not daring to return. Then she cursed that she had not asked Theodore not to call her that in front of others. The other knights began to take offense at the deputy commander, that she did not pay attention to them and sadly expressed some childish claims to her. She replied disgruntled that they were just fools. Laverne suggested that there was some kind of game going on between the deputy commander and the newcomer, as she had already witnessed a rather unusual scene in her office. One of the knights, after listening to Laverne's story, also confirmed her opinion, because they had no other explanation why a representative of the royal family called Louise mistress. Louise's hair stood on end from the knight's assumption about such an appeal by Theodore, and she had no idea that her knights had such a wild imagination. Therefore, the young girl decided to immediately explain this situation to everyone, so that there would be no unnecessary gossip, because this was the only thing she did not have enough of right now, so she began to think of how to get out of it. Louise said that she would explain everything now, and nothing came to her mind. Theodore noticed the girl's confusion and decided to intervene in this awkward situation, saying that he was in debt to the lady. The knights really liked the beginning of the story, so they asked Louise what the representative of the aristocratic family owed her, because for them it was something unusual. Louise blinked her eyes in confusion and told the knights to ask Theodore that question themselves, because he would have something more interesting to tell about it. She herself did not really know the answer to this question. The knights returned to Theodore and waited for the explanation of the culprit of today's holiday, and the young man just continued to dreamily look at Louise and remain silent. There was a dead silence at the table, and no one dared to ask Theodore himself directly about why he called their deputy commander a mistress. Louise herself noticed that there were no brave people willing to ask about it from the representative of the royal family among the Knights of November. Therefore, Louise decided that she would not have a better opportunity to leave this party, and quietly turned around, heading for the exit. At that moment, Laverne offered to play the game Truth. The knights looked at Laverne curiously, waiting for her to explain the rules of the game. The girl happily announced that Theodore was the culprit of today's holiday. And then Laverne added that in order for everyone to learn better about their new knight, they should take turns asking Theodore something that most interests them from his biography. But the most interesting thing in this game was that if Theodore does not answer the question, then, as a punishment, he drinks a glass of cocktail prepared according to Laverne's personal recipe. Laverne immediately reached into her bag and announced that for her exclusive cocktail, she had brought a secret ingredient to enhance the effects of this healing potion. Louise did not like this idea anymore because she knew about this famous Laverne drink and what the consequences were after it. Meanwhile, Laverne took out a bottle of expensive wine from her bag. All the knights present looked at the exquisite drink and swallowed their drools. One of the knights asked where the young girl managed to get such an expensive drink. Laverne smiled sweetly and said that she borrowed a little of it from the captain's office, because there are too many of them in his stocks and it's okay if he shares with the knights. One of the knights present told Theodore that this game is the best option to get closer to the new team, because at the tip-off, people say everything they really think and without filters. Then Louise made a decision not to leave her knights alone, because she knew how all this would end. Therefore, she approached Theodore and asked him if he agreed to the terms of the game. She was sure that he would definitely accept such a challenge and was absolutely sure of it when Theodore, with a smile, said that it was just a wonderful offer that he would not refuse. Then Louisa doomedly took off her outer garment and thought that Theodore had no idea what he was signing up for, either because of his naivety or stupidity. But she could not throw him at will. All the knights were delighted that their deputy commander agreed to play this provocative game with them and loudly exclaimed that there was no better deputy commander to look for. Morrison looked at Louise and asked if she was really sure she wanted to play this game, and the girl answered that, although Theodore is of royal blood, he is now one of the Knights of November. Laverne had already started whipping up her famous potion, from a glass of which everyone was 100% sure that it was possible to knock over a bear as well. Therefore, everyone watched Laverne's skillful movements with interest. Meanwhile, Louise pondered the question and came to the conclusion that she saw nothing wrong with it, because Theodore himself would not ask the question, and everyone else should not have provocative questions. Laverne was the first to venture her question to Theodore, and immediately asked if he liked Miss L. Hearing that, the drink that Louise was drinking at the moment could not stay in her mouth and she spat it out. Morrison saw his second-in-command's reaction, so he immediately asked if she was okay. Meanwhile, Louise could not get over the shock of the first question. When the young girl regained consciousness, she saw that someone handed her a napkin so that she could wipe herself. Louise raised her eyes to look at her savior and saw Theodore, who smiled mysteriously at her and said that his mistress now desperately needed this napkin. Confused, Louise reached for a napkin and thanked her for her concern. When she put herself in order, she thought that Theodore's behavior was not at all similar to his usual one. There was silence at the table, and no one took their eyes off the couple, who were sweetly chatting at the table. The knights began to shout that there was definitely something between them, and hurried Theodore with an answer. Theodore tore his attention away from the young maiden and told the knights that of course he would be happy to answer the question without exaggeration, to put an end to this delicate matter at once. The knights held their breath and waited for their new knight's answer. But Louise instantly blushed and loudly told Theodore not to answer this question, but to drink a cocktail. But the knights were waiting for some kind of action, so they supported Theodore in his decision to give an answer, and said that they were also interested in finding out what was really happening between them. Therefore, Theodore decided not to delay the answer, and said that if he was frank enough, then to him, Lady L. And without finishing his phrase, he looked mysteriously into her eyes. Louise's temper broke in, and she could no longer control her emotions, so she shouted loudly for Theodore to drink this cursed glass immediately, because this is not a request, but an order. Theodore decided to obey his boss, so he took a glass with that famous drink in his hands and said that he could not refuse his mistress, especially when she ordered. Therefore, the young man drank the drink down in one gulp, and looking at Louise, said that she had been spoiling him since the first days of his stay in the ranks of the Knights of November. Laverne disappointedly told Morrison that she thought Theodore would actually say he loved Louise, if of course the deputy commander would let him answer her questions. Louise saw the empty glass that Theodore had placed on the table and remarked to herself that if she had her way, she would strangle Laverne for the idea of playing this game and for her miracle cocktail. Theodore said that the drink was simply incredibly tasty, and all the knights looked in fear that he drank it in one gulp, because they all knew what the consequences would be after drinking it. Laverne thanked for the compliment on her miracle cocktail and said that the recipe has been passed down from generation to generation, and that is where its power and secret lies. Louise noticed that Theodore's eyes had become glassy, and she asked how quickly he got drunk after drinking alcohol, because he didn't look the least bit like a sober person. Theodore replied that he never counted after which glass he got drunk, and she noted about herself that the representatives of the royal family have alcohol flowing in their veins instead of blood. She did not have time to calm herself mentally when Theodore continued the sentence and said that he did not count the glasses, because he was always drunk until he lost his pulse. Louise was not only surprised by what she heard, but also frightened. Lavarin said that this is just great news and they should continue playing this game, especially since the cocktail tasting is over and they can move on to the next level. Laverne then asked aloud which of the knights would be the next to ask the question. At first, the knights hesitated, because they did not know whether it would be right to force a person of royal blood to get drunk. Louisa remembered the captain's words that one wrong step, and she would not save her head, so she cursed, realizing that if she continued like this, she would not be able to get to one place without an accident. Laverne laughed and said that if no one had the courage to ask Theodore a question, she had another interesting question for him. Before Laverne had time to ask her spicy question, she heard the voice of Lady Ellie, who asked to wait with the questions, because she has some changes in the rules of the game. Louise confidently sat down in a chair near the table and announced that from now on, she would be the Dark Knight instead of Theodore, and took a glass with Madame Laverne's masterpiece cocktail in her hands. Louise decided that for general safety, she should drink instead of Theodore, because she saw from his appearance that he was already drunk enough even after the first glass. Morrison helped Louise to regain consciousness in the fresh air and asked if everything was okay with her. Louise replied that of course not, because he should know all the consequences of Laverne's cursed cocktail. Morrison worried about his second-in-command and couldn't leave her alone when she needed his help. Therefore, supporting her, he said that she didn't drink that much. Louise asked Morrison if he had any negative impressions of her after witnessing tonight's game. Morrison replied that she carried herself with dignity enough. After all, as soon as Louise took hold of the glass, the tongues of the knights were loosed, and such provoking questions poured out that the young girl just wanted to empty the glasses. Morrison apologized for Laverne because she was one of his subordinates, and he thought he should have controlled her better, which he now regretted. Louise replied that he should kill it, because if it weren't for Laverne, Theodore would never have been able to fit into their team because of his aristocratic origin, so it's only for the best. Morrison excitedly asked if Louise understood him, and the girl replied that the only thing she understood today was that thanks to alcohol, they all managed to get as close as possible. Louise then put her hand on him like a close friend and said that tomorrow on the pitch, when they lined up for training, they would be even closer after tonight's game. Morrison once again felt bad. Louise couldn't resist and said that now he was fully punished for not being responsible enough and allowing others to mess with him. Louise also added that the fact that Morrison did not cope with his subordinates deserves a special punishment, and for this case she personally prepared an exclusive punishment for him. They would have continued to talk sweetly and heard that something was wrong inside and, looking into each other's eyes, decided that they should urgently run for help. Louise was the first to fly into the room, and her mouth dropped open at what she saw. She shouted, asking what the hell is going on here and waiting for an explanation from her subordinate knights. But no one was able to give a clear explanation, because all the knights were ass-drunk and only Laverne could still develop her famous drink for those knights who were still able to move. Louise's gaze rested on Theodora, who was lying on the table and was unable to move. The knights hastened to explain that they had tried to stop Laverne, but it was beyond their power. Laverne also tried to make excuses, explaining the situation by the fact that Theodore should have stopped himself at the beginning of this game if he knew that he did not tolerate alcohol. But Louise did not want to hear these excuses. Late at night, her superior was engaged in reviewing important paper documents, so she was focused on work when someone knocked on her office. The princess allowed to enter. Her maid came into the room and said that it was quite late and it was time for Her Highness to rest. The upset princess replied that they haven't had time to do anything yet. But the maid didn't even want to listen to any refusals, saying that the princess is the future of this state, and first of all, she should worry about her health. The nanny suggested the girl go to the bedroom,